Hello, everybody. I'm going to be real brief. I'm John DeGraff. I know many of you, but many of you I don't know. I am delighted to have all of you here and hope we'll have even more tomorrow for our next 2 days of the conference. Tonight we have a real treat for you with former Governor John Kitzhaber of Oregon. And to introduce the governor and to welcome you to Seattle University, where she teaches, I want to bring up April Atwood. There you go. Thank you.
Welcome. It's my, get it loud enough. My pleasure to be able to welcome you on behalf of Seattle University, the host institution for this weekend conference. It's actually very fitting and appropriate that this conference, focused on issues around time and our approaches to this limited resource and on quality of life and social justice issues, is being held at Seattle University, which is a Jesuit institution. So I'd like to take a few minutes before I turn it over to our governor guest, just to talk a little bit about why this is such a good fit between this institution and these efforts. I've seen some very hopeful, hope-giving developments, directions in some different fields that are related in one way or another to the issues that we're going to be talking about this weekend. 3 that I want to talk about tonight. So first of all, at kind of a grand level, Seattle University is a Jesuit institution. So I didn't grow up that way, but I have learned what that means. Jesuits focus on service. A lot of their discussion and focus as an institution is on how to serve, especially the poorest among us as a world community. They also place incredible value on education as the means for improving the state of the world. So it makes sense for a university to, I think, perfect sense for a progressive university. Part of the mission of the university here is that we help to prepare leaders for a just and humane world. And we have an amazing number of students who they can repeat back the mission. They come here because of the mission of the school. I find that very inspiring. The Jesuit sect is on the progressive end of the Catholic faith, the Catholic umbrella. The current Pope, St. Francis, came to his current office from the Jesuit branch of the faith. That was an unusual step. He recently issued a papal encyclical, long essay that was on the topic of on care for our common home. It was lauded as his declaration of opinion and state of environmental-related issues, but he also talked a lot about social implications of kind of the current state of the world. His essay touches on so many of the topics that we're going to be discussing at this conference. I wanted to point out a few. He calls on people to consider the causes that threaten the relationships of man to nature, the environment, and also man to each other in a host of various circumstances. He specifically points out that, and this is a quote, "A sober look at our world shows the degree of human intervention, often in the service of business interests and consumerism, is actually making our earth less rich and beautiful, ever more limited and gray, even as technological advances and consumer goods continue to abound limitlessly." He goes on to say, a certain way of understanding human life and activity has gone awry, to the serious detriment of the world around us. Should we not pause and consider this? At this stage, he says, he proposes we focus on dominant technocratic paradigm and the place of human beings and of human action in the world, related to things we're going to be talking about this weekend. He touches on the dangers of inherent, he says, in the technological roles and the roles of technology in people's lives, reminding us that technological products are not neutral. They create a framework that ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities and social interactions along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups. That was very right on. He also calls for what he calls an integral ecology, considering the whole system. He said the environment can't be separated from the analysis of humans, from family, from work lives, urban context, rural context, from how individuals relate to themselves and how they relate to each other. This sort of systems view is definitely the dominant paradigm in considering sort of sustainability at all levels these days. He also highlights additional dangers of consumerism and says, the emptier a person's heart is, the more he or she needs things to buy, own, and consume. It becomes almost impossible to accept the limits imposed by reality. In this horizon, a genuine sense of the common good also disappears. As a professor in the business school, this touches me deeply. Moving through. Those of you who are Catholic, or who know people who are Catholic and institutions that are Catholic, can appreciate the impact of any papal message to his followers. This Pope has reached far beyond just Catholics. He's been warmly and widely received around the world and has had broad appeal and broad impact. So I find that a source of hope. A second source of hope for me, and this one's a little more at a specific level, closer to my work, and as a faculty member in the business school, was a reflection from a cardinal within the Catholic organization entitled "The Vocation of the Business Leader." This was published in 2012, so it's not brand new, but he talks about businesses and market economies, when they're functioning well, they serve the public good. And recent experience has demonstrated the failings of businesses and markets. And he points out that some of the developments that we deal with all the time, globalization, communication technologies, and what he calls financialization, end up focusing a lot of attention on commercialism and on and we recognize negative impacts of the communications technologies, bringing information overload, rushed decision making. It's like, well, all of us can identify with that. And the financialization of business, he says, has intensified tendencies to commoditize the goals of work and to emphasize wealth maximization and short-term gains at the expense of working for the common good. He does say that good business decisions are possible, rooted in ethical principles. And a couple of the principles that he focuses on, one is considering all the stakeholders who are involved, which this is a theme that comes up again and again in my teaching, considering all the stakeholders of a business and business efforts. He also focuses attention on the principle of, and I'm quoting him here, organizing productive and meaningful work, recognizing the human dignity of employees and their right and duty to flourish in their work. Work is for man rather than the man is for work kind of model. The dean of our business school has widely distributed this essay, The Vocation of the Business Leader, and has set the goal that all the students who are in the business school will encounter it in depth in at least one of the classes that they take within our school. I'm not Catholic. Most of our faculty are not Catholic. But having an approach such as this serve as the basic orientation of our teaching work allows us to point out and offer up for discussion many of the business decisions and situations that could be made better through this kind of orientation, considering the fundamental development of all business stakeholders. These classroom discussions and the course assignments can only serve to sharpen the awareness of our students, our future business leaders, about the problems and the opportunities in the world and how their own decisions can have an effect on larger well-being. So I find that a very hopeful development as well. And then finally, this is my third and last one, but another encouraging development is at an even more personal level for me, since I teach sustainable business courses in the business school. And that is the increase in the number of courses that are being taught about sustainable business. And that's at an international level, at a national level, at our local level, in so many schools. I've been teaching it for almost 15 years now, and in the beginning, almost no one was teaching this stuff, and now almost everybody's teaching something, and I think that's astounding. Early sustainable business efforts focused on environmental impacts, but as the field has developed, there's increasing focus on social impacts as well. Environmental was a lot easier to measure, so that got focused on first. But social impacts of business are now receiving a lot of attention. One of the original frameworks for teaching sustainable business talked about the triple bottom line, the 3 Ps: people, planet, and profit, all three. An even more modern version of that talks about people, planet, profit, and purpose, which is kind of along the lines of some of the vocation of the business leader ideas. In recent years, there's been a big focus, as I said, on social impacts of business, and there's a focus on people as employees, people as members of the communities where businesses are located, people as customers, people as partners of a business, suppliers to a business, other stakeholders of a business. So there are a lot of what I find just really exciting developments and exciting areas of focus within the area of sustainable business. One of them is on social enterprises. One of my favorite examples, and I like to plug this company or this organization whenever I get a chance, so this is my opportunity, is to be able to talk about Greyston Bakery. Anybody know Greyston Bakery? Some people do. Yeah, they're from New York. They're located in New York, and however, they sell their brownies all across the country through Whole Foods, and they also supply brownies to Ben & Jerry's. So if you've had any of their brownie ice creams, you've had Greyston brownies. Greyston Bakery is a social enterprise. They were set up to have double bottom lines. So they were looking at being a profitable bakery, but they also wanted to have positive social impact. And the way they describe their company is, we don't hire people to bake brownies. We bake brownies to hire people. They have what they call an open hiring process. So they keep a list of people's names, who wants a job with the bakery. And when an opening occurs, they go to the next person on the list, and they have the job, no questions asked, which is awesome. They also provide childcare, they provide housing support, and they provide training and development support for their employees. Increasingly also within the realm of sustainable business, companies are being asked by watchdog groups and by investors to report on their corporate social responsibility activities. So these reports are becoming much more standard, and this is only over the past 5 years. There are structured reporting systems and metrics and standards that are being developed, not just for environmental performance now, but also for social impacts and social performance as well. And that's related to some of the topics we're going to be talking about tomorrow in some of the sessions. Also, there are widespread laws and initiatives and regulations emerging that have to do with social impacts. And those range from supply chain issues to slave labor issues to working conditions, pay scales, discrimination. Emerging at a national level, like the Dodd-Frank Act. They're emerging at state levels, like the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act disclosures. And at the local level, we've seen a lot of activity here around minimum wage changes and initiatives, and also fair scheduling debates that are taking place right now. So that's a hugely hopeful development in my view. More and more, there's a lot of research being done and a lot of data indicating that more and more CEOs are expressing an interest in the corporate social responsibility activities of their firms, largely because their feet are being held to the fire by watchdog groups and activist individuals and organizations. And I think the outcome is a good thing, one way or another, how we get there. And there are lots of benefits. I mean, what I can say to my students is, the bottom line is there are lots of benefits to companies to doing well by their employees. There are financial benefits, and finally the research is coming around to demonstrate that companies who do well by their people are doing better financially. So that's a win-win-win kind of situation. They end up with employees who are much more loyal, who are more productive, who are less likely to leave. And they end up being companies that people want to vie to work for, rather than the companies having to put more effort into recruiting. So I feel fortunate to be able to teach in the area of sustainable business and to be supported in that effort here at Seattle University, to encourage our students to learn to think differently about what successful business can really mean and can really be. So for these reasons, I'm really excited, and I feel good that Seattle U is able to host this conference this weekend, this year. I'm excited to hear more details about the specific topics over the course of the next couple days in lots of the sessions. So welcome to the conference. Hope you have a great weekend. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker this evening. John Kitzhaber was elected 4 times as governor of Oregon. You've read his background and of his experiences. I'm not going to bore you with repetition. What I do want to say is that I especially appreciate his participation and contributions to this conference because of his unique perspectives. That of a physician who's able to bring a health orientation to issues of time, work, and leisure, and that of a government policy expert who can share ideas about what is needed on the policy side to enable some of these changes to come to pass. So thank you, John, for your support and participation here. We look forward to learning from what you will share.
It's very dark in this podium, so I'm going to have to look down at my notes, and when I do that, if I leave the mic up there, I'll probably lose you. It's really great to be here. My name's John. I'm a recovering workaholic. And so when John DeGraff asked me to participate in this conference, I was delighted to have the opportunity because this is an interest of great area of great personal interest to me. It's also good to be back in Washington State, my birth state, which I used to like to remind Governor Inslee was once part of, and still is, in my view, a part of the Oregon Territory. Taking back your time, I think, is a very, very worthy goal, and I'm aware of and very supportive of the objectives of this national organization. Certainly, overwork can lead to stress. It can cause lack of productivity at work. It can cause a strain and disruption of relationships at home, and it can cause serious physical problems. The Japanese actually have a word for this. I think the word is karoshi, which literally translated means death, overwork death, which is strokes and heart attacks from overwork and a poor diet. This organization, as I understand it, seeks to raise awareness of the importance of vacation time, to try to bring a cultural change at the workplace and in home life about the importance of time, leisure time in particular, and to support policy changes that advance those goals, like paid vacation time, paid parental leave, raising the minimum wage, prorating benefits for part-time workers, etc. I'm very supportive of all those initiatives, and I know that you're going to be discussing those in great detail over the next 2 days. What I'd like to talk about tonight is the fact that there is a larger reason, a larger system problem that makes those initiatives necessary in the first place, and that has to do, quite frankly, with the fundamental nature of the American economy. So this evening, instead of getting too granular, I thought I'd try to provide you with kind of an overview and a context for the discussions you're going to be having over the next few days, and talk a little bit about, and explore what I think is the most serious consequence of overwork, and that is the erosion of the time necessary to build community, and an erosion of the time necessary for the reflection and imagination that is needed for each generation to fulfill its responsibility to the next. So my intention isn't to offer you a list of policy solutions this evening, but try to give you some food for thought, some questions to consider over the next couple of days, and some perspectives that you can use as you develop your strategy for taking back your time. So I want to start by sharing a bit of my own story as I was growing up and my relationship to time, talk a little bit about how I came to be a workaholic, how I managed to recover, and what I learned along the way. So I was not born a workaholic, certainly. Both my parents did grow up in the Great Depression, and valuing hard work, they instilled in me a strong work ethic, certainly one of their greatest gifts to me. And during my youth, I was born in Colfax, Washington, in the heart of the Oregon Territory. And until I was 16, I led a rather nomadic life. We lived in Pullman, we lived in Seattle, we lived in Logan, Utah, Lawrence, Kansas, Portland, Oregon, Hanover, New Hampshire, before finally moving to Eugene, Oregon to settle down. And what kept it all together through all those moves, many of which were really difficult for me and my two siblings, was my parents. And as hard as they worked, they really did believe in the importance of vacation time, of unplugging, of reconnecting with nature and with each other. In the 1950s, it was a lot easier to unplug than it is today. We only had 3 television networks, all black and white. We didn't have any cell phones, no internet, no faxes. But still, 60 years ago, it did require a certain amount of planning and a certain amount of discipline to be able to get away on vacation. And every year my parents did it. No matter where we were, we took a vacation in the summer. And some of my fondest childhood memories actually involve these vacations, these camping trips we took in the summer with our family. And they were always led by my father, and we'd sally forth armed only with this old Coleman stove that I still have, and a giant canvas umbrella tent with an elaborate metal infrastructure that could attract lightning strikes from 4 or 5 miles away. And we took this gear and we camped on Bear Lake, Utah, that straddles the Utah-Idaho border. We camped up on the Snowy Range of Wyoming. One summer we camped at Yellowstone and then drove all the way to the Pacific Ocean that I'd never seen before. And we stayed in Long Beach on the north side of the mouth of the Columbia, not far from where Lewis and Clark spent the winter in 1805. And in 1962, when we took our final move, when we moved from Hanover, New Hampshire to Eugene, Oregon, I was 15 going on 16, and it was a really difficult move for me. And I was very nervous about starting my sophomore year at South Eugene High School, which had a student body of 1,500 kids as opposed to the 200 kids at Hanover High School. And what I remember most about that year, going into my sophomore year, almost 16, was not the trauma of being thrust into this big school with no friends. What I remember most is that my father recognized my apprehension and my loneliness, and he took the time. He took the time out of his schedule to take me camping. And we left our umbrella tent behind, and we took our Coleman stove to the banks of the great rivers of Western Oregon. Rivers with magical names like Santiam and Umpqua and Rogue. And it was along those rivers when I was almost 16 years old that I first met wild salmon in their native habitat. And it was in the spawning beds at a place called Boulder Flats on the North Umpqua River that I had the occasion to first see these scarred and broken warriors, these brave creatures planting the seeds of tomorrow and making their contribution to the future. Because if you think about the life cycle of the salmon, it's all about nurturing and sustaining that which will come. And the salmon that I grew to know as a boy were born in the gravel beds of these cold, fast-moving streams that come down the west slope of the Cascade Mountains, and they migrate down and out into the ocean where they spend their lives and mature until some inner voice tells them it's time to come home. And on their final journey, these amazing creatures travel thousands of miles and leap huge obstacles. They elude predators in this single-minded effort to return to the very gravel where they were born. And even the salmon that don't make it, the ones that die in the process, give their bodies to the river and provide the nutrients that are necessary for the next generation. And throughout my life, that experience has served as a metaphor for me, not just about the relationship between life and death, but also the responsibility that each generation owes to the next, to do everything we can to leave the world just a little bit better for our kids than when we inherited from our parents. But to fulfill that responsibility requires time. It requires the time to be able to get away and unplug and reflect and imagine. Because fulfilling that responsibility, imagination matters. Imagination is the foundation of creativity. It's the foundation of ingenuity and innovation. And imagination was very, very important for me when I was a kid. My dad used to read to us every night. I don't know if you've ever read to your kids. I certainly read to my son. And one of my favorite books was called Wind in the Willows, and it was by someone named Kenneth Grahame. And I've carried this one passage down the long years, and I want to share it with you for just a moment. And here it goes. He thought his happiness was complete when, as he meandered aimlessly along, he suddenly stood by the edge of a full-fed river. Never in his life had he seen a river before. This sleek, sinuous, full-bodied animal chasing and chuckling, gripping things with a gurgle and leaving them with a laugh, to fling itself on fresh playmates that shook themselves free and were caught and held again. All was a shake and a shiver, glints and gleams and sparkles, rustle and swirl, chatter and bubble. The mole, for it was a mole, was bewitched and entranced and fascinated. By the side of the river he trotted, as one trots when very small, by the side of a man who holds one spellbound by exciting stories. And when tired at last, he sat on the bank while the river chattered on, the babbling procession of the best stories in the world, sent from the heart of the earth to be told at last to the insatiable sea. I think that's a lovely passage. Now, for someone who has spent much of his time on, in, and near rivers, that remains one of the richest and most realistic descriptions of a river that I've ever heard. But the suspension of belief that's necessary to fully appreciate this description is enormous. A river, arguably, is an inanimate object. And this is a story, this is a description that's coming to us through the eyes of a mole. A mole whose best friend is a water rat, and who has adventures with a badger, and with a pompous toad, who, by the way, can drive. If Kenneth Grahame had lacked the capacity to imagine, we would never have known these delightful creatures. And if we were not willing to suspend our belief in the way things actually are, we would never be able to fully appreciate the accomplishment that he achieved in that book. So the point is, I've come to believe that it's this capacity to imagine and to wonder and to dream that gives us the ability to fulfill our responsibility to the next generation. Albert Einstein once said that you should not use an old map to explore a new world. And he was absolutely right, because each new generation faces a new world with a whole new set of challenges. Challenges that can only be met by building a new set of tools, by imagining a new set of solutions. And that challenge can only be met through imagination. So having time to be able to unplug, and the luxury of imagining and questioning and dreaming impossible dreams is the one essential element that allows us to leave the world a better place with more promise and more opportunity than when we inherited from our children. But there are two more ingredients required. So the time to imagine and reflect is absolutely critical, in my view. The two other requirements are you have to have a community that can take action on that imagination, on the ideas that are produced by that leisure. And we need to engage all of us in this endeavor, not just some of us. And to explain, I'm going to give you another story also from my upbringing, and it also involves my parents. My father was born in 1915 in Iowa, and my mother was born in 1917 in Joseph, Oregon. And they met at Pullman in 1939, both graduate students, and they were married in November of 1940. When World War II broke out, my father was drafted, and leaving his bride of less than 2 years, got on a ship in New York Harbor for the dangerous 2-week trip across the Atlantic. And from the time he was drafted, and for the 17 months he was with Patton's Army in Europe, my parents wrote to each other every day. And I've always thought it was a poignant tribute to their 65-year romance that they kept every one of those letters. And in 2002, my father edited them and put them into a book that he simply called The War Letters. And he gave a copy to me and a copy to both of my sisters. And this is really a remarkable document. And it chronicles the period between September of 1943 and November of 1945. And it tells the story of two citizens, two ordinary Americans and new parents, and the amazing sacrifices that they made to win the Second World War and to rebuild the world in its aftermath. And before my father died in 2006, I used to call him up every June 6th, the anniversary of D-Day, and I would thank him for saving the world. Because that is exactly what that generation did. Not only did they win the war, they came back and built our system of higher education and the transmission grid, and they gave us the civil rights movement and the leading landmark environmental legislation of the 1970s. And they passed the amazing social programs of the last century, Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and they went to the moon. They went to the moon. So I grew up believing in government, believing that it is a vehicle through which we could take collective actions and do amazing things for society that we couldn't possibly do as individuals, like the interstate highway system, like bringing electricity to rural America, like the GI Bill. But what I've learned along the way is that those kinds of remarkable accomplishments are only possible if there's a sense of common purpose. Because a sense of common purpose is the one ingredient essential to build community. Now, why is that important? It's important because a community that's held together by a sense of common purpose and has the cohesiveness that brings people together and allows them to take collective action is what allows us to do things that none of us could do by ourselves. But building community, like imagining, requires time. And if the main focus of a person's life is work, if they're just struggling to get by, they don't have a lot of time for common purpose. They don't have a lot of time to help build community. They don't have a larger reason to interact with others. And that undermines community, and community is essential to take the collective action to act on the ideas and the innovation that will help our kids have a better world than the one we had. But there's more. A community is only as strong as the members who are a part of it. And if a growing number of people don't have the time to fully participate or the time to imagine and dream, that not only do we lose their unique contributions, but we weaken the community itself. And this insight, which requires just a bit more explanation, came to me over a long period of time, during which I became an alcoholic. There you go. Workaholic and then recovered. So I want to start with how I became a workaholic in the first place. Given my upbringing and the value that my parents placed on time and vacations. I don't know if you recall the wonderful passage from Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, where Bill Gorton is asking Mike Campbell how he went bankrupt. And Mike says, well, in two ways, but gradually, then suddenly. And that was sort of how I became a workaholic, gradually and then suddenly. Now, the first symptoms begin to emerge after we moved to Eugene in 1962. And I was this new kid on the block with all the adolescent anxiety and self-consciousness that were associated with that. Now, from my earliest days, I wanted to be a scientist, more specifically a naturalist in the best traditions of Charles Darwin and William Beebe, and especially Dr. Dolittle. So throughout my childhood in Kansas, my parents displayed this remarkable tolerance for my wide-ranging activities, from chasing and mounting butterflies to dinosaurs and digging up fossils to model rocketry to taxidermy. But once we moved to Eugene, as I was turning 16 and struggling to be accepted by my peers with only moderate success, this interest in science began to follow an ominous and somewhat relentlessly accelerating course. By the time I was 17, I was sleeping on the couch because I turned my basement bedroom into a laboratory, complete with workbench, assorted glassware, Bunsen burners, dissection equipment, and a resident supply and population of white mice and 2 hooded rats. As a consequence, I began to gain a reputation, well-deserved I might add, of being somewhat odd in the halls of South Eugene High School, which did not help my social integration at all. And this reputation was confirmed in 1965 when I won the first place in the Northwest Science Fair. My entry was a perfusion apparatus that would allow me to study isolated organs kept alive outside the body. Now, as I say on NPR, the following description may be somewhat graphic. My project involved a kidney that was borrowed from my younger sister's pet rabbit, Clyde. Now, before you call the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, I anesthetized Clyde, and Clyde lived for another 2 years, a ripe old age for a rabbit, which is approximately the same amount of time it took me to repair my relationship with my younger sister. But Clyde's kidney, newly liberated, ended up in my perfusion apparatus, a feat made possible by perfusing it or circulating warm, oxygenated blood through the kidney. it gets worse. So for blood, I would go in the early hours of the morning out to Falkenstein Slaughterhouse in West Eugene, where I would crouch in the shadows watching the understandably nervous cattle mill around until one of the poor creatures was killed and bled, and then I would dash in with my Erlenmeyer flask filled with penicillin and an anticoagulant and collect my blood. Now, this collection routine often caused me to be late for school, and my blood-spattered arrival at first period math class cemented my reputation as a nerd and most probably a dangerous one. But from then on, my course was cemented. I worked harder than I'd ever worked before, and I worked incessantly. I went straight from high school to Dartmouth College. I graduated from Dartmouth in 1969, went straight to the University of Oregon Medical School. 2 weeks after that, I was an intern in Denver, and a month after that, I was practicing emergency medicine in Roseburg, Oregon. Elected to the House in 1978, the Senate in 80, 84, 88, and then elected governor in 94 and again in 98. So for 33 years, from the time I graduated from high school in 1965 until the end of my second term as governor in 2003, I never even came up for air. I was a total workaholic. Now, at Dartmouth, the focus of my workaholism was science. But that shifted in 1968, a very significant year in my life, and I imagine in the lives of some of the people in this room here today, when some events happened that had a profound impact on my life direction. And while they didn't change my relentless focus on work, they did sow the seeds for what I call my eventual recovery. First, on April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King was shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee. A tragedy that touched me deeply in ways that I did not fully understand at the time. But Bobby Kennedy, who had announced his candidacy for president 1 month earlier, continued to champion many of the issues for which Dr. King gave his life. In particular, he called out the failure of our public institutions to address the deep inequality that existed in America and the social and community disintegration that flowed from that failure. He spoke of the violence of institutions, of indifference and inaction and slow decay, the violence that afflicts the poor, that poisons relations between men because of the color of their skin, and the slow destruction of a child by hunger, and schools without books and homes without heat in the winter. And he spoke about a GDP. This is 1968. The GDP that measures air pollution and cigarette advertising and nuclear weapons and the loss of the redwoods, but does not measure the quality of our children's education or the joy of their play or our courage or wisdom or learning or compassion. A GDP, in Bobby Kennedy's words, that measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile and can tell us everything about America except why we are proud to be Americans. And his campaign, and those of you who were there can remember this, was unlike any campaign I had ever seen before or after. It was a campaign totally focused on equity and opportunity. It was about unrepresented farm workers in California. It was about poverty and hunger and children starving to death on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota and on the Delta in Mississippi. And it was a campaign that asked these profound questions and disturbing questions about a GDP that measures wealth but not well-being, and how such inequality could exist in the wealthiest nation in the world. And then on June 5th, right after winning the California primary, and after spending 83 days, I think it was, raising these uncomfortable questions, he was shot and killed, as you know, in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. And although I had been totally apolitical 3 months before that, from the moment he died in Los Angeles, I knew that I wanted to commit my life to public service. And I was going to save the world just like I thought my parents had done. But those events did not cure my workaholism. They simply changed its focus. And throughout medical school and my internship and my first 3 years of practicing emergency medicine in Roseburg, my passion for public service never waned, and I was convinced that my future lay in elective office, not in a white clinical jacket. And starting with my election to the House of Representatives in 1978, for the next 22 years straight, I served in public office in Oregon. Workaholic all the way. Now, the odd thing is that during this time when I thought I was living the dream, they had this recurring feeling that something was missing. I had this sense of incompletion. I was really busy. I was working incredibly hard, doing things that I thought were important and meaningful. Yet I had this underlying restlessness. Something was missing. And I called this feeling skipping along on top. Skipping along on top. And it wasn't until my second term as governor ended in 2003 and before I ran for a third term in 2010 that I actually had the time to sit down, slow down, and reflect about what that feeling, was all about. What was missing? Bobby Kennedy inspired me to a life of public service, but I was so busy for 22 years becoming a doctor, becoming a state legislator, becoming a state senator, becoming a governor, that I had missed the central point of his campaign. For over 2 decades, I'd missed the central point of his campaign. I'd missed the core message that inspired me in the first place because I was skipping along the top. I didn't actually have the time to reflect on what those events meant to me. And that message was really simple. If a sense of common purpose is the one essential ingredient necessary to build community, and if community is what brings people together to do things collectively that would be difficult or impossible for them to do by themselves, then the strength of the community is inversely proportional to the level of disparity or the level of inequity that exists within it, or that we allow to exist within it. And what Kennedy's campaign was about and what he was doing for those 83 days is he was calling out the disparities and inequalities within our society and asking, why are we allowing this to happen in the wealthiest nation on the planet? That made a lot of people really uncomfortable in 1968. That was 48 years ago, and asking those same questions today still makes people enormously uncomfortable. But these questions have to be asked, and they have to be answered, because disparity is the enemy of community. Disparity is the enemy of community. It separates us, it divides us, it reflects inequality, it reflects a lack of fairness that I think is very, very important to people on an individual basis, and it means that someone's being left behind and that someone is being excluded from the community. And for those who are excluded, there is no community. If there is no common purpose, then there is no community. And if there's no community, then we can't possibly successfully meet the challenges that we face today, and we can't possibly leave the world a better place for our kids. So to me, the single most glaring inequity today in America, the thing that more than any other single factor undermines community and undermines common purpose and sucks the leisure time from the soul, is the growing income and wealth disparity in the United States of America. Now, why is that? It's because this inequality results in a growing number of Americans who are workaholics. Not because they choose to be, not because they want to be, but because they have to be. People who are trapped in low-wage jobs or part-time jobs, people who have no way up, who have no way out, and who have no hope of actually having a better life or leaving their kids better off than they are. In fact, it's going in the other direction. These are people who constitute a growing segment of America and a growing segment of the communities that you and I live in. And these are folks who don't have time to help contribute and build community. They don't have time in many cases to meaningfully interact with their kids, to take the time to recognize when they're feeling lonely or left out. These are people who don't have the time to unplug and get away, and they don't have the capacity to reflect and to imagine and to dream impossible dreams. The fact is, these are people who can't take back their time, because it is impossible to live in this country today on $10 an hour or even $15 an hour, given the cost of health care and housing, without working long hours, without both parents working, without working 2 or 3 jobs. And I think that this increasingly intolerable and indefensible situation is a direct result of 2 things. There are many factors, but there are 2 in particular that I'm going to call out. The first one is our changing definition of the purpose of corporations in this country. And the second one is the way in which we measure economic success. Several months ago, as some of you may know, NPR's Marketplace started this series called The Price of Profits. And it is really worthwhile, and I would go online and look at it if you have an opportunity. But the central thesis is that there was a time in this country dating back to the 1970s when corporations put customers first, and then employees, and then community, and then, as a distant fourth, shareholders. Somewhere along the way, that was turned on its head in the last 2 decades of the 20th century to a shareholder value economy. And this notion that the single purpose, the mission, the responsibility of corporations is to maximize shareholder profit. And let me give you an example. There's a company called Gilead that makes a drug company makes a drug called Havardis, which is a cure for hepatitis C. So it's a pretty amazing drug. It costs $90,000 for a course of treatment. Some people need 2 courses of treatment. Last year, this company made $19.2 billion in cash profit, and they spent $7.7 billion, or 45%, buying back their own shares to increase the value per share. That's just unexcusable. And that is why this new definition and acting on it is one of the major drivers of wealth and income disparity in America. This is a much bigger thing than corporate tax rates. This is a real problem. And it's exacerbated by the way we measure economic success. Because the way we measure economic success is totally divorced from the well-being of Americans. It's totally divorced from the health of our economy. We measure economic success by 2 things: the number of jobs we're creating and how fast the GDP is growing. And, by those metrics, we are doing really well in this country. We've gained back all the jobs we lost during the Great Recession, and we have more people working today than ever before. But how does that translate into the well-being of our fellow Americans, right? How does that translate into their ability to meet their basic needs or feed their children or support their families, let alone having any time for anything but work? Well, the answer is, Bobby Kennedy pointed out in 1968, not very well. It doesn't translate very well. It's not that good jobs aren't being created. They are, but they're not being created as fast or in the numbers of the good jobs that were lost during the Great Recession. And the fact is, most of the jobs that are being created are at the lower end of the wage scale. So the result is, as the American economy becomes more and more productive, real wages for most workers, after inflation has been taken out, have been flat or falling for decades. And this is not a new phenomenon. If you look at the period between 1945, the end of World War II, and about 1973, the productivity of American workers increased 96%, and wages increased 94%. Between 1973, which is when we started to begin to see this shift, productivity increased 80%, and this is between 1993 and 2011. So productivity increased 80% and wages increased 10%. So in short, American workers are more productive today than they've ever been in the past, but they're not sharing equitably in the wealth that they're creating. And that creates a whole subculture of forced workaholics who don't have the ability to contribute to community, to give their ideas to the rich mix of how we meet the future. And, that should be really troubling to all of us, because one of the basic, I think, bedrock principles or assumptions about our country is that hard work is actually rewarded with a better life. That if you put your shoulder to the wheel and work hard, you're going to be able to improve things for your kids. And for a growing number of Americans, that is just simply not the case. And not only is this profoundly unfair, but it widens the disparities between us, and it makes it more difficult to come together as a community. So the reality is that more and more Americans today simply can't take back their time. They don't have the time to contribute to the community, and they certainly don't have the time to reflect and imagine and dream. And the reason is they're just trying to get by. They are trying to survive day to day and paycheck to paycheck. And we are all just deeply impoverished by this situation. We are losing their creativity, their imagination, their compassion, their energy, and their hope that they could bring to our communities and to our society and help us in figuring out how to address the problems that we face today. Now, there's not one single solution to this, obviously. There's not any easy answers. But I do think that if we want to make any progress, and I'm recommending this to you strongly over the next few days, we have to start by asking the right questions. And Thomas Pynchon, in his novel Gravity's Rainbow, wrote, if they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. And if the only question we ask is how many jobs are we creating and how fast is the GDP growing, then we don't have to answer the quality of those jobs, or where they are, or what they pay, or whether they're connected to upper career pathways, or who's getting them, or the environmental cost of creating them. So as you embark on this 2-day examination of how to take back your time in the United States of America, I would leave you with two things. First, I would encourage you to be very mindful of the quality of questions that you ask, because the quality of the questions you ask will dictate the kinds of answers that you get. And we need to ask uncomfortable questions and disturbing questions and questions that make people nervous. Secondly, don't be discouraged by the magnitude of what you have undertaken here, because it is critically important to the future of our country. And we got a lot of dedicated people here who blew off the Seahawks game and drove through traffic to get here. And that speaks a lot about the folks who have decided to come to this conference and lean into this amazing challenge. So let me just conclude by saying that, in 1968, when I had my political awakening, and when I decided I was going to save the world like my parents did, I was 21. I was young, I was naive, and I was very idealistic. I've learned a few things over the years. I've learned that saving the world is a lot harder than it sounds. That it doesn't happen with a flash of lightning, it doesn't happen with a clap of thunder, and it doesn't flow from inspirational speeches, although inspiration is very, very important. Bobby Kennedy was a very inspirational speaker, but I have no idea whether he would have been a good or effective president. But what I do know is what he dreamed, and what I think many of us dreams, won't happen without time. It requires time and a lot of hard work, and it's often really unglamorous work in the trenches, making compromises, dealing with competing agendas, building coalitions and alliances, and sticking in there even when there are setbacks. And here's something else I've learned, and I think this is really important. I've learned that people across our country want community. They yearn for community. They yearn for a sense of greater common purpose. And all they need to fulfill that yearning is time. So after a long and somewhat turbulent political career, it's a whole other topic, in public service, I am no longer young, as you can see, and I am certainly not naive. But I'm still really idealistic. I still believe that all of us want to be better than our own worst day and give something back to our families and give something back to our communities. And I still believe in the power of individuals working from courage and conviction that they, in fact, can change the world in which they live for the better. So my hope this evening is that with your help and your commitment and your leadership, one day each and every American will have the time to actually do that. Thank you. So I would not be offended at all if there are no questions, but I'd be happy to engage you if you'd like. And yes, sir. Well, I know they're very miserable in Texas. People are very unhappy in Texas. Well, I don't think there is. I will tell you, Sylvia and I had there, Sylvia. Just wave your hand there, dear. Great green champion, the green goddess, I call her. We had an opportunity to go to Bhutan in 2013, where at the time they had the gross national happiness, which essentially was a set of really practical metrics that would make sense to everybody, but it was a lens through which they judged their governmental policies. And as an example, they were considering whether or not to bring in helicopters for sort of ecotourism, right? And they weighed, the cost of the fuel, the potential for greenhouse gases, the noise pollution, and the money. And they, through their lens, they decided this was not something that they wanted to do. It did So I think the nearest thing to that is the genuine progress indicator, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. We were working on one in Oregon. I know some folks up here are working on one, which actually is an accounting system that measures the intangible things that Robert Kennedy talked about in his speech on the measure of a nation. So if you're a stay-home parent, if you're taking care of a child, if you are taking care of an elderly person or doing volunteer work in the community, that's counted as a plus for the GDP. Right now, locking someone up in prison counts is very positive, and just the same as educating someone. So it's a very poor measurement of our values. And I think that conversation, particularly finding people who are actively working on putting the GDP into states, Maryland has one, I think that would be very, very important. Sylvia? Yeah. I probably would have given you a different answer a week ago. I've been reading this really interesting book called The Fragmented Republic, which I would recommend. It's very interesting. And the premise of it, and we'll in fact answer your question, and then maybe we can go get something to drink, is that both that we are blinded by the politics of nostalgia. That is, progressives remember fondly the 1960s, and I would certainly count myself as one of those. You had strong labor unions, the environmental movement was coming on. We were trying, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement. There was a lot going on, kind of increased liberalization of the country. And the conservatives remember the 1980s, which was a sort of an economic boom. But both of those things represent an aberration, right? And they really, we define sort of the last half of the 20th century by those 2 decades. And in fact, we've reached a point now where there's a eroding of faith in big public institutions and private institutions. They're increasingly less able to actually solve our problems. And his point is that we've got to let go of the nostalgia of the past in order to actually see how we go forward. And he thinks that the solution is empowering what he calls the middle structures of governance, where people actually talk face to face: families, communities, local government, associations. And so I think that history will look back at this as a period of profound transition, and one in which the political structure is having trouble letting go of what the past was and trying to recapture the 60s or recapture the 80s instead of actually looking at what's actually happened in America and proposing solutions for the future. And I think if you look at both of the candidates, and there's certainly differences between them, but they both are viewing America through the lens of that old corporate model. That actually built careers and financial security that defined the middle class. And that doesn't exist anymore in America. So the question is, what do we replace it with? So history will either judge us positively or negatively, but I do think that this is a huge period of transition where we need to figure out how to let go of yesterday and actually embrace a new set of structures and solutions for the future, which requires imagination. Yep. Okay, 2 more and then we'll finish. Yes, sir. You're asking me? I am a sort of a technological troglodyte. I mean, I didn't grow up with computers and all of this stuff, so this is not my natural realm. But I do think social media, there are definitely pluses and minuses to it. I think one of the big minuses is the anonymity, and with the new sort of clickbait media culture, it's sort of the new mob. I think Sylvia's going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow. So there's definitely a negative side, but it does allow people to connect in a very powerful way. I guess my concern, this is probably showing my bias, I still think there is no substitute for people sitting at a table talking to each other. And whether it was the Oregon Health Plan or whether it was, I can list a whole host of really contentious issues. Where if you get people sitting around the table, it's much harder to vilify each other. And if they do it 3 or 4 times, something magic happens, and people begin to see each other in a different way. They begin to see past the politics and see past the policies to the personalities, and it is building community. And so, if there's a way for social media to enhance that, that would be great. But I worry, quite frankly, that there's an impersonal nature to it that doesn't build that kind of really tight personal connection that I think is so important to building community. Yes, sir. I don't have a lot of faith in Congress at this point in time. I'm glad that we've got Paul Ryan, but I talked to Greg Walden, who's Oregon's Republican member and very high up in sort of the House leadership, and he thinks that Speaker Ryan's going to run into the same small group of folks that sort of jam things up for Boehner, although they're getting smaller. So, I think it's desirable. And the disconnect to me is that if you shorten the work week, you've got to figure out a way to make sure that the productivity, this isn't a productivity problem. We're enormously productive as a country and as a workforce, but we need to figure out how some of that wealth, some of the wealth that productivity is creating actually ends up in the pockets of the people who are doing the work. So they're not in separate things. You can shorten the work week, you can have more vacation time, But if people's hard work doesn't actually get them ahead, if they don't have enough money in their pockets to take care of their kids and not worry from paycheck to paycheck, then we haven't accomplished our objective, which is, I guess, what I was trying to say at the beginning. I think all of these policies are incredibly important, but they have to be seen in a larger context. Vacation time by itself is important, but if you can't put bread on the table, if you're worried about your child's next meal, that's going to trump really everything. It's just right out of Maslow's hierarchy. So, okay, hey, thanks very much for the chance to be here tonight.